It's time to join the celebration. Cheers. Is that blood? Greetings, my fellow freaks and weirdos. I'm Tom, and welcome to Monster Gab, where we love to talk about classic and vintage horror. Vintage certainly being the key word today. As of the release of this video, it is officially the year 2022, and that can only mean one thing to me. It has been 100 years since the release of Nosferatu, the silent German horror classic. That's right, this movie is officially 100 years old. An entire century has passed since its cinematic release. Directed by Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau, Nosferatu is one of the most iconic movies ever to be released in both horror and cinematic history, not to mention influential to future movies of the horror genre. And it's the first ever surviving screen adaptation of the most famous vampire novel ever written, Dracula by Bram Stoker. I'm sorry guys, this cape is absolutely irritating me. I'm gonna have to take it off. Ugh. Away with you! So, as I mentioned earlier, Nosferatu is indeed a German silent movie, but it was translated into many other languages, and the version that I'm going to review today is going to be the English language version. But we're not just going to review the movie, we're going to celebrate its existence. But we are indeed celebrating this movie for two reasons. The first being that it's just 100 years old. I know I can't stop saying it, but I think it's amazing. The second reason being that we shouldn't actually be exposed to this movie. It was ordered to be destroyed. It wasn't meant to exist, which would have been an absolute shame because it is indeed a masterpiece and an iconic gem. So the fact that it does exist and we are able to experience it is worth celebrating alone. Now, I have mentioned this bit of trivia in my review of Nosferatu in Venice, but I don't mind mentioning it again. As I stated earlier, the movie is based on the novel Dracula by Bram Stoker. However, director F.W. Murnau didn't actually have the rights to make this movie. Stoker's widow owned all of the rights to the novel and wouldn't give permission for it to be translated into film. In order to avoid any kind of lawsuits or issues with copyright, director F.W. Murnau, along with screenplay writer Henrik Galeen, made a few subtle changes. Some of the biggest changes were the names of the characters. For instance, the evil vampire that we all know as Count Dracula is now referred to as Count Orlock. And for those of you who are familiar with some of the original characters from the novel, Jonathan Harker is now referred to as Thomas Hutter, and Mina has also been changed to Ellen. Other changes were made too, such as the names of towns and destinations, as well as subtle changes to the story itself. However, all of the changes made in this movie were done in vain, as the Stoker family did indeed sue and won the case, meaning that all copies of this movie were ordered to be destroyed. And indeed they were, or at least the master copies were destroyed anyway. The movie that we all know and love today has been made up of second copies and prints that had survived around the world. I find this fact to be amazing because, like I said earlier, this movie is an absolute masterpiece. It would be an absolute shame if we couldn't experience it today. Now, trying to convince people to watch a silent movie in this day and age is not always easy. After all, it's a complete different experience to any other kind of movie, not just due to the age of it, but because of the way it's portrayed. After all, it's a silent movie. There is no audio apart from the music or the score in the background, and although it does have dialogue, it's all done in the form of text, as well as a lot of the storytelling. Compared to any other kind of movie in existence, watching a silent movie does require a particular state of mind. It's not like watching anything else. It is indeed a completely different experience, but it can still be a fun experience providing you accept it for what it is. Now, I have a lot of trouble trying to get people to watch subtitled films, or even films that are simply just in black and white. I don't know why that's an issue, but it is to some people. What I will say is, I don't expect you to like this film or enjoy it, or even watch it if you don't want to, but you should at least acknowledge it. You should appreciate its existence and respect it, because after all, it really did set the platform for future horror films. Of course, it's not the first ever horror film to be made, but it really was influential to future movies, and to me, it's the holy grail of horror. I actually have a deep appreciation for some of the silent movies, especially the horror ones, and some of my favourites being Metropolis, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and of course the Lon Chaney movies such as Phantom of the Opera, but Nosferatu is certainly my favourite. Considering the age of this movie and the fact that it is indeed a silent movie, there are so many versions of this film available. Different translations, for instance, but just different qualities and different cuts of the movie too. For instance, there is a beautiful version of this movie on Blu-ray where the movie has been completely restored and cleaned up. A lot of the specks and the scratches that came along with the original prints have been removed, and the movie has never looked as good. There are versions of this movie that are in original grayscale. There are also versions of the movie that have coloured filters, such as blue filters to kind of show the nighttime scenes and yellow filters to show the day. There's all kinds of versions of this film. I actually prefer the movie to have its original specks and scratches and its grainy look, because to me that just adds to the aesthetics of the film. After all, it is indeed a horror movie, and it does kind of give a kind of scary look. But I also consider those specks and scratches to be the movie's battle scars, because after all, this movie wasn't meant to exist, and because it was made up of second prints and copies, I just kind of feel those specks and scratches are the movie's way of saying up yours to those who tried to destroy it in the first place. There are also versions of this movie in different languages, of course, but there are versions where the text and the dialogue has actually been changed slightly. In some cases, the characters' names have actually been changed back to those of the characters in the original novel. There are also versions of this movie with different music, scores, and soundtrack accompanying the film. The original piece of music composed by Hans Erdmann is probably the most fitting, because after all, it is the original piece of music. But it is interesting to watch this film with different music behind it. I've watched it with a heavy metal background before now, and it really did work too. It gives the film a complete different feeling. But I've also watched this movie with a very modern horror score behind it. You know, that typical low rumbling bass, almost like it's leading up to a jump scare. And again, that really works with the movie too. So not only do I recommend checking this film out, but you should check out different versions of it too, just to see what different feelings you get from it. Okay, I'm going to struggle with the names of the cast members here, so I'm going to try my best. But this movie stars Max Schreck as the evil vampire Count Orlock. It also stars Gustav Von Vangenheim as the character Thomas Hutter. Greta Schroeder plays Ellen, and Alexander Granek plays Nock. I don't know if I pronounced those names right, but you can let me know in the comment section if you know any better. Okay, so here is the synopsis. The year is 1838. Thomas Hutter, played by Gustav Von Vangenheim, is working for an estate agent and sent to the current home of the evil vampire Count Orlock, played by Max Schreck, in Transylvania. It is the Count's request for Hutter to sell him a new house in Visborg, Germany, the hometown of Hutter himself. In fact, the house directly opposite his own. On his journey, Hutter receives fair warning from the townsfolk of the evil that resides in Orlock's Transylvanian castle before experiencing it firsthand and becoming a prisoner trapped within the castle walls. However, before any torment takes place, Hutter manages to sell the deeds to the Count after Orlock gazes upon a picture of Hutter's wife, Ellen, played by Greta Schroeder, and instantly develops some form of affection for her. Orlock travels to Visborg, causing death and terror along the way, creating rumours of a great plague as many victims who cross his path suffer an evil fate. It becomes a race against time, as Hutter not only needs to escape the castle of Transylvania, but find his way home to his beloved wife Ellen before Count Orlock does, and discover a way to defeat the evil vampire once and for all. Well, let's talk about this movie then, and the first thing I want to mention are the visuals, because many aspects of this movie were just shot so beautifully. Many of the locations and the buildings really do give this film a look of dark and gothic romanticism, especially a lot of the outside locations, including harbours and villages. But then there are the scenes that were shot indoors that not only look authentic, but there appears to be a genuine intent to keep the rooms kind of small. Particular doorways, entrances and arches, even coffins, were purposely chosen to fit right around the characters like an outline, especially that of the character of Count Orlock, as it gives an essence of claustrophobia. It's almost like the film is trying to make the audience feel like there is no escape. In fact, some of the set designs were actually modified or reconstructed to fit with this compact image. Director Murnau really does show off his artistic talents in this movie with the use of shadow play, as there is quite a lot of shadows and silhouettes used in this movie. In fact, there's one particular scene where we see Count Orlock ascending a staircase, or at least we see his shadow anyway, and this scene has become so iconic that I'm sure many of you who haven't even seen the movie are probably still familiar with this image. Not only can we see a character so dastardly and evil ascending a staircase, but the artistic use of the shadow really does add to the element of horror. There is no way you can look at this image without assuming that this character is some form of monster and clearly up to no good. Many a time when Orlock is about to attack one of his victims, we see his shadow rather than the monster himself. Not only is this done for a truly creepy effect, if not artistic and stylish, but it also adds an almost paranormal quality to Orlock's character. As far as the character designs are concerned, most of them are fairly good. There is one character that does bug me a little bit, the character of Nock, played by Alexander Granach, I don't know how to pronounce his name. Basically, he plays the part of Nock, who is an estate agent, and his image is fairly over the top and quite eccentric. I'm not going to criticise his image too much because, after all, it's very theatrical, and due to the age of this film, it came from a time where theatre was still king and theatre was still transcending into film. A lot of films of this era were still very theatrical. Not to mention that his over-the-top and eccentric image is quite fitting to his character, because his character is meant to be completely mad. For those of you who are familiar with the original novel of Dracula, the character of Nock is basically a hybrid of two characters, Mr. Hawkins and Renfield. Renfield, of course, being completely mad. And so, like I mentioned, his image is fitting to the persona of his character. Most of the other characters look fine, they're wearing the correct attire according to the period of when the story was based, but of course we're here to talk about the main vampire villain himself, the Prince of Darkness, Count Orlock. Max Schreck really does play a great role as Count Orlock with pure expressionism in this movie, but it's the image of his character that really does it for me. They really went for a monstrous looking image here, where Count Orlock is a fairly long and lean looking character, but he's always arched and leaning forward, and everything about him is sharp and pointy, from his pointy nose to his pointy ears, even his sharp long claws and protruding teeth, or fangs if you like. Count Orlock is obviously this movie's equivalent of Count Dracula, and if you look at any other movie adaptation of Dracula, normally the character is fairly charismatic, he's charming, he's handsome and fairly romantic, and a lot of that trend started off with the actor of Bela Lugosi, who starred as Dracula for Universal Movies. Now don't get me wrong, this is an image that really does work when it comes to the character of Count Dracula. Well, of course it does, because it's been used so many times. It's the image that most people refer to when they think of Dracula. And my favourite Dracula was Christopher Lee, who carried on this trend for the Hammer movies, for instance. But I also think it's important to remember that Count Dracula is indeed a monster. After all, that's how he's portrayed in the original novel. Quite often he's referred to as fairly serpent-like, a bit like a lizard or a snake. However, Nosferatu has made Count Orlock's character to look almost rodent-like, especially with the central positioning of his fangs. Normally when we see images and movies of vampires, the fangs are fairly widespread, almost canine-like. However, Count Orlock I think has been made to look a little bit more like a rat, which is a bit unfair because I actually think rats are quite cute, to be honest. But I get why they've done this. I mean, after all, there is the rumour of a plague being spread around, and obviously we refer to rats when we think of the Black Plague, for instance. I do kind of see it actually, especially with the pointy nose and the protruding teeth, and I believe that one of the original movie posters actually did have the image of a rat on it too. Again though, I think rats look kind of cute, to be honest. Count Orlock doesn't though. Count Orlock looks like a real monster. They've just kind of based him on a rodent really, but I think he looks absolutely brilliant. One of the things that I really do love about Count Orlock's character is the fact that he actually gets 3 entrances in this movie. His first entrance is where he's disguised as a coach driver and picks Thomas Hutter up to take him to the castle of Transylvania. We kind of have an inkling that it's Count Orlock, but they don't really reveal it. His second entrance is where we truly get to see him represent himself as Count Orlock, and he walks out of this kind of dark void or tunnel, and he's surrounded by a lot of open space, which is contradictory to the rest of the movie because, as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of enclosed spaces that give the film a feeling of claustrophobia. But in this case, we see him surrounded by a lot of open space, so we can truly see the shape of this character, the fact that he is tall and gangly and pointy and just kind of misshaped and monstrous. However, during this scene, although Orlock still looks fairly monstrous, he uses good manners and comes across as quite a polite individual. But then later in the film we see a third entrance where Orlock really does portray himself as a vampire and a monster, and it's this entrance that really does make the movie. It's probably one of the most iconic scenes in the film. Thomas Hutter peeks out of his bedroom doorway at night and just sees this dark abyss. There's a clock chiming in the background, and amongst this darkness we can see Count Orlock just standing there menacingly looking into Hutter's room. We see a terrified Hutter close the door and climb into bed as he has no means of escape, only for the door to open by itself and in walks Count Orlock. The door frame fits the shape of Orlock perfectly. There is no way you can get past him, and again gives that essence of claustrophobia, no escape, and inevitable doom. It's a perfect scene and it's just iconic. It definitely is one of the scenes that really does make this movie a true masterpiece. I've no doubt it terrified audiences in the day. Folks, I'm currently in the process of editing this video and I'm having to cut a lot out. I really did talk so much about this film, so I'm trying to trim the fat. But there is one thing that I didn't mention, I think is really important, is the scene where we see Count Orlock just rising out of the coffin, his entire body, and again, it's just such a terrifying image. And I know I keep using the word iconic a lot, but it truly is iconic. Anyway, I'm going to get back to editing and I'll try and leave in as much as I can and keep this as interesting as possible. The acting is a little difficult to explain due to the fact that this is a silent movie, so of course there's a lot of expressionism, which was popular during the silent era because of course a lot of exaggeration had to be used to get across any kind of point. It's a different style of acting that you'll see in any other kind of movie due to the fact that it is indeed silent, but it's something you just have to appreciate for what it is. However, the character Gustav Von Vangenheim, who plays Thomas Hutter, comes across as a bit too exaggerated for my liking and a little bit over the top. A lot of the times he seems a bit comical and a bit of a buffoon, and I don't think it fits with the movie. From what I've read online, he was actually the third choice actor for this role, and maybe that explains a little bit. And the character of Nock, played by Alexander Granach, I can't pronounce his name. I don't know. Anyway, the character Knock, to me, the acting is just a little bit too exaggerated again. I understand that he's playing the part of a madman, but it just seems a little bit too over the top at times. But, you know, I mean, this movie is very, very theatrical, and I do appreciate that it is a product of its time too. With that in mind, I'm not going to knock it too much. No pun intended with his name being Knock. Anyway, as far as the story is concerned, it's obviously based on the novel of Dracula, which is one of the best horror novels of all time. So obviously the story is fantastic, even with the subtle changes made to it. There are special effects in this movie that have dated, I suppose, but I mean, this film is 100 years old, so I'm not going to criticize them. But there are scenes where a horse and carriage has been sped up when it's traveling to give a kind of paranormal effect. There's some color inverting at times, but I think a lot of that is because some scenes were shot in the day and it's meant to be at night. But again, you know, it looks a bit weird, but I'm not going to criticize it. This film is a century old. There's even a cheap disappearing effect where we see a character filmed in a particular location and then they'll take him out and they'll film the location again and add a bit of smoke and it looks like he's disappeared. It's a cheap effect, but again, it doesn't take anything away from the movie. You can still appreciate it and enjoy it. Let's talk about the pros and the cons of this movie then. And the biggest pro for me has got to be the visual aspect. The fact that this film looks so gothic and terrifying. Back in the day, this must have really scared audiences. They wouldn't have been exposed to anything quite like this. And as far as I'm concerned, this movie got banned in Sweden until the mid-70s. It just looks absolutely terrifying. From the authentic set designs to actual buildings and locations used, really give this film a visual strong point. Another pro for me is the fact that this movie tells the story really well, considering its running time, because the movie is about an hour and a half, and, you know, it's based on the book Dracula, which is a massive book, so they've really had to cram a lot into that time, and I think that they tell the story really, really well. Another pro for me is the fact that this movie is in the public domain due to the fact that it is 100 years old now, and due to that there are so many variations of the movie and it's available everywhere. You can see it on YouTube, you can buy Blu-rays and DVDs. There is no excuse to not be able to watch this movie. The only cons that I have for this movie are some of the exaggerated acting that I mentioned earlier, and the character design of Knock just seems a little bit too eccentric, but it's nothing major. It certainly doesn't ruin the movie in any way. The special effects may have dated, but I am not putting them in the con list. That would be totally unfair. I mean, this movie is 100 years old, for goodness sake. I'm not doing it. So, rating this movie out of 10, well, I'm going to give it a strong rating of 8.5. No, I'm going to give it 9 out of 10. I truly do believe that this deserves quite the high score. It is the holy grail of horror movies as far as I'm concerned, and it truly needs to be experienced, or at least it needs to be appreciated and respected. So guys, what do you think? Have you seen Nosferatu of 1922? What variations or different versions of this movie have you seen? Please do let me know in the comments section below. And did you enjoy the movie? I think it's one of the greatest horror movies ever made. It certainly is the holy grail of horror. I know I've said that a few times now, but whatever. I honestly think it's an amazing movie and totally worthy of a review, even 100 years later. Anyway guys, let me know what you think in the comments section. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time. I don't know who they are, but if you don't subscribe, they will get you. So make sure you are indeed subscribed if you haven't done so already. Click that notification bell, share this with your friends, leave a comment and a like. Thank you so much for stopping by. Take care. See you soon. Bye-bye. 100 years! 100 years!